Well, kids, oh my goodness, it's been a bit of a difficult year this year, hasn't it? So many problems, and you can't go to school, and you can't go hang out with friends, and you can't go to restaurants, and now we hear that campus even canceled. So many disappointments, so much sadness. And so I thought, well, what are we going to talk about at this children's service today? And I thought, you know what? We're going to talk about a person in the Bible who had all kinds of problems. Big problems. And his name was Joseph. Joseph. Now, why would we going to talk about somebody in the Bible who had all these different problems? Well, this is the reason why. See, Joseph didn't have a big old pity party over his problems. He didn't just have a temper tantrum. No. Joseph actually learned to look at his problems in a way that he saw God at work, even in the midst of his difficult circumstances. And I think we can learn from that. He just saw that God was able to bring good out of bad. And that's my hope, in part at least, that we can learn to do that as well with all our problems. Now, Joseph, real quick, it's a long story, many chapters in the Bible, so I'm just going to give you a quick overview. Joseph came from a huge family, a blended family, if you will, and he had a lot of brothers, and they didn't like him. And there's three big reasons why they didn't like Joseph. Here's number one, reason number one. Joseph had seen his brothers do something bad, and he told their dad about it. And he had seen that, and he had spoken the truth about what his brothers had been doing. And of course, his brothers didn't like that. Well, the second reason why they didn't like Joseph was that Joseph had dreams. And his dreams, in the dreams, his brothers would bow down to Joseph. Well, they didn't like that idea either. And then finally, Joseph actually was their dad's favorite son. Yeah. And his brothers didn't like that. And so one day, his dad had brought him this beautiful coat, this garment, and his brothers were, of course, jealous of all that. And so they did not like Joseph, and they were so annoyed by him that one time they grabbed Joseph, ripped off his beautiful coat, and put him in a pit in the ground. He couldn't get out, and they were planning on killing him. But then some business people came by, and they thought, you know what, instead of killing him, we could just sell him as a slave. And so they sold Joseph into slavery. And then he took his beautiful coat, ripped it up, put some blood of a little lamb on it, and then he went to their dad and said, Dad, this your favorite son, it looks like wild animals got a hold of him and killed him. And his dad was all sad, of course, and there was no longer a Joseph in the family. Terrible story. Meanwhile, Joseph was taken by these business people to a land far away called Egypt, where he was a slave. But Joseph, like I said, he kind of made the best of things. He made the best of bad situations, and he worked hard, and his master appreciated that and put him in charge of many things, and it was all going well. Till one day he was falsely accused of doing something, and he ended in prison. I mean, things went from bad to worse. Now he was in prison. But again, Joseph doesn't throw a pity party. He works hard, he is trustworthy, and he's, again, given all kinds of responsibilities. And one day, in this prison, there were some men there locked up who had some dreams, and Joseph helped them figure out what those dreams meant. Now, that's a kind of a side story, but it becomes very, very important later on because, well, a long time after that, the king of the land had a dream as well, or had some dreams, and he couldn't figure out what those dreams meant, and nobody could help him figure it out, till finally one of these men who had been in prison remembered this guy named Joseph, and so they hauled Joseph out of prison, and Joseph, with God's help, helped the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, figure out what that dream meant. And the dream meant that it was going to be 7 really good years with lots of rain and lots of warm weather, and the crops would grow, and then it was going to be 7 years where there was going to be a famine, where there was going to be no crops growing. Well, of course, the Pharaoh was so thankful that Joseph helped him figure out this very important detail, that he made him the vice president of the land, kind of thing. And Joseph now became a man who first had been a slave and then had been in prison and was now the second in command in the entire land. Amazing, a place of great power. Anyway, this is where the story gets really interesting. Because remember how Joseph's brothers had gone home and had told their dad that Joseph had died? Well, Joseph's brothers were getting hungry too because there was no food. But Joseph himself, as the second in command in the country, had made sure that they had kept and stored up a whole bunch of the grain that had been grown in those first 7 years. And so there was food in Egypt. And Joseph's brothers then, who were hungry and kind of starving, they finally went to Egypt to get food, and they meet Joseph, but they didn't recognize him. Remember, they thought he was a slave. Meanwhile, there's this man standing before them now who is like the king of the land, and they didn't even recognize him, and they're kind of scared of this king, and they needed his favor. And so what did they do? They bowed down to Joseph. Remember the dream that got him into so much trouble with his brothers? That his brothers would bow down? Now they're bowing down to Joseph, not even realizing that it was their brother. Anyway, long story short, Joseph finally tells them who he really is, and then he allows the whole family to come into Egypt. And there in Egypt, they settle down. There's enough food. Joseph makes sure they're all fed, and so it's a great ending to a story, if you will. But then, after 17 years of everybody being back together, Jacob, the dad, passes away. He's a very old man, 147 years old when he dies, and when he dies, they bring him back to his old land, they bury him. But then the brothers are getting afraid because they thought, you know what? Maybe Joseph was just nice to us because our dad was still alive. But now that dad is no longer alive, maybe he's going to get even with us because we've been really mean to him. We've caused him so much suffering. Now he just might get mad at us and he's going to do all kinds of horrible things to him. So this is what we read. Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When the message came to him, Joseph wept. And his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. Isn't that an amazing, amazing story? They're the brothers who have been so mean to Joseph. They're now afraid of him because he is powerful. And they ask for forgiveness. "Would you please forgive us?" And then what did they do? They throw themselves on the ground. Not to throw a pity party. No, they bow down. They honor Joseph. Again, just like the dream had said so many years before. They bow down to Joseph. Because they're scared. They're afraid. They're worried. But now listen to what Joseph said. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. An amazing story, an amazing turn of events. Joseph looked at all the bad things that had happened to him, and instead of trying to get even, he spoke kindly. He had learned to look at all the bad things that happened to him from a different angle, and he had learned to see that God was in it, that God was bringing good out of the bad. And I wonder if it would be good for us to do the same thing. That we look at all the bad that's happening around us, and to not say it doesn't matter, because it does matter, and some of those things are really difficult and really disappointing, and they're hurt, and there's people that have lost loved ones, and they're sad and they're grieving, But could we step back and look at all the bad like Joseph did and see God at work in the midst of it all? Can we recognize that God might just be bringing some really good things out of the bad things too? So this is my homework for you. Honestly, I'm going to give you homework, and not just you children, all of you. Talk with each other about the good that is coming out of the bad. Talk with each other about the good that is coming out of the bad. And then please share that with the rest of the church family on the Facebook group. Just put it in, and if there's a way and there's some good responses, maybe we'll find a way to share that with the entire church next week during next week's service. But please talk about this and share it with the rest of us. What are the good things that God is doing that are really coming out of the bad that has been taking place this spring? Now, it is absolutely wonderful to learn that a story like this, the story of Joseph, teaches us this whole idea that God can bring good out of bad. But I want you to understand that the story goes far, far beyond that. And so I'm going to really quickly point that out to you. And this is basically how I want to explain this to you. You know this book, the Bible, right? It's one book. Well, not really, actually. It's actually a combination, a collection of 66 books. They're all put together and basically split up in two parts, the Old part and the New part, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament has 39 books, and the New Testament has 27 books. And the whole book is really about God's plan to rescue us. Really, the book is about Jesus, the Son of God. Especially the New part is really clear. It talks about Jesus all the time. So those last 27 books, they're abundantly clear that it's about Jesus. But the first part, the first 39 books too, are about Jesus, including this story of Joseph. You see, you may not have picked up on that. So I want to point it out because it's really important for us to understand that the old part of the Bible too is about Jesus and about God's incredible plan to save us. So let me just point out 10 similarities between Joseph and Jesus. Here we go. Number one, both Joseph and Jesus were loved by the Father. Oh yeah. Number two, they both knew that they would be honored, that people would bow down to them. I mean, Joseph knew that through his dreams, but Jesus knew that too, right? I mean, he's God the Son. He came from heaven. He knew the whole thing, the whole story, how this was going to unfold. He knew that people would bow down to him. And one day, all nations will bow down to him. Number three, both Joseph and Jesus were hated by their brothers. Jesus' own brothers didn't like him either. Number four, both had their robes taken away from them. I mean, Joseph's brothers took his robe and ripped it up with blood on it and gave it to his father to kind of sell him this lie. But Jesus, well, they took his robe when they crucified him, and they didn't rip it up then, but the soldiers cast lots over Jesus' robe. Number five, both Joseph and Jesus were sold for pieces of silver. Joseph for 20 pieces, Jesus for 30. Both were falsely accused. I mean, Joseph didn't do what he had been accused of that landed him in prison. And Jesus, of course, hadn't done anything wrong. He was sinless. He never sinned. Both were falsely accused. Number seven, both suffered greatly. But great good came from it, both times. We saw that. Joseph suffered greatly so that many people could be saved from starvation. Jesus suffered greatly so that many may be saved from hell. Both Joseph and Jesus, in a sense, fed people. Joseph stored up all this grain so people wouldn't starve. He fed them that grain. Jesus, of course, well, you remember the story about how he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed thousands of people. Both Joseph and Jesus were pulled from the pit. Joseph was pulled from this old well, this dry well that he couldn't climb out of. And Jesus was really pulled out of the pit of hell, the pit of death. He overcame death. He overcame that pit when he rose from the dead. And here's one for you, the last one we'll look at today, and there's many more, but both were willing to be used by God to accomplish God's will. Both were willing to be used by God to accomplish His will. Now, all these similarities I want you to understand is more than just interesting. It is really, truly helpful if we recognize that the first 39 books of the Bible, the Old Testament, are really pointing to Jesus. It helps us understand what the stories are really all about. And it helps us to understand that you and I then are in a sense just like Joseph's brothers. That we are just like the Egyptians, that we're just going about their lives, we're being annoyed by different things, didn't like other things, and all the while didn't realize that disaster was coming. That without someone doing something, we would all die. Joseph, of course, unless he had done what he did, well, the people in Egypt and Joseph's brothers would have died of starvation. But Joseph was willing to be used by God, and so they were saved from death. Jesus, too, came and he warned people. He explained what was coming. And he put things into place. He responded. He did things that made it possible for us to be saved. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead. It's when we now believe in him and we trust him, we can live forevermore. But it will require that we bow the knee as Joseph's brothers had to do. We've got to humble ourselves before him. We've got to allow Jesus and his Spirit to lead us. We've got to live in obedience to his will. It's an amazing story, this whole story of Joseph, isn't it? The whole story, sure, it teaches us that God can bring good out of bad, but so much more, it points us to Jesus. Will we listen and learn from that story? Will we humble ourselves? Will you humble yourself? Will you, like Joseph's brothers, ask Jesus to forgive you? Will you bow down? Will you come to Jesus as Jesus has invited you? And that includes you, children. Let the children come to me. That's his call. Will you come to Jesus? And that's a question only you can answer. Father, I pray for your children of all ages, that indeed we would come to you each and every day, that we would never get so stubborn that we would turn our back on you. Lord, help us to humble ourselves, to bow down before you, to worship you, to confess that we too have been wrong, to allow you to welcome us, in a sense, to allow you to feed us, to allow you to have your way with us, because you are good and your love endures forever. Father, I pray you would give the wisdom to us needed to learn these lessons. And in the midst of all our troubles, help us to grieve over the things that we have lost, but at the same time, Lord, help us to see that you are alive and well, and that you are working in the midst of all these difficult things. Lord, again, help us to trust you always. I ask you this in Jesus' name. Amen.